I never thought something as simple and as necessary as a tornado siren could cause so much chaos. But then again, I also did not think I would find myself battling a neighborhood HOA in retirement. After 35 years working as a meteorological engineer, including contract work with FEMA and state disaster planning, I moved to a quiet community in eastern Oklahoma, thinking I had earned peace. Wide lawns, clean streets, a place where I could finally put down my weather instruments and maybe learn to enjoy the silence. But silence, as I would learn, can be dangerous. I bought the house at the end of Linden Trail, a corner lot with an open backyard and enough space for my personal radar dish, a small weather tower, and yes, a personal tornado siren I had salvaged, refurbished, and installed discreetly on a reinforced pole behind my garage. It was a short-range alert system programmed to activate only when I detected tornadic conditions with specific velocity signatures. It would not wail for every thunderstorm. It was surgically precise. I had even added a soft test mode barely louder than a car alarm to run monthly diagnostics. The day I finished calibrating it, I stood in the backyard, arms crossed, listening to the low hum of the test cycle, and felt a rare sense of peace. It was not about control. It was not even about science. It was about protecting people, because I have seen what happens when alerts come too late. I have stood in the rubble. I have pulled bodies from basements. And I was not going to let my neighbors suffer because someone thought sirens were ugly. I should have expected what came next. The first note was taped to my door in a plastic sleeve. It was official HOA stationery, gold trim, bold serif font signature at the bottom from Karen Mulligan, HOA president. It read like something from a high school principal scolding me for violating neighborhood aesthetic policies by installing an unauthorized mechanical structure. No mention of function. No questions. Just an order. Remove the siren within 7 days to avoid penalties. I laughed at first. I genuinely thought it was a misunderstanding. So I called the number listed and left a message. Then I printed out a short letter explaining the purpose of the siren, along with my FEMA certifications license details, and a polite request to meet in person. I even added a line offering to speak at a community safety meeting if people had concerns. 3 days later, I got a knock on my door. Karen Mulligan was exactly what you would expect: early 50s, tightly wound blonde bob haircut, manicured nails, gripping a leather folder like it was a courtroom exhibit. She did not say hello. She pointed at the siren visible over my fence and said, "That needs to go. It's creating panic." I blinked. It's not even active yet. It's calibrated to only go off. It's a siren, Mr. Bailey. She cut in, emphasizing the word like it was profane. Our community values tranquility. You can't have that blaring and upsetting our children and pets every month. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level, "that's the test cycle. It is as quiet as a distant horn. You'd hear worse from garbage trucks." "We didn't approve it," she snapped, pulling out papers. "And our bylaws prohibit the installation of any visible utility equipment not expressly authorized by the board." I felt the tightness in my chest begin to build. Not anger, not yet, but the tension of being talked down to like I did not know what I was doing. I've worked disaster response for most of my adult life. That siren could save lives. Karen crossed her arms. "We have city sirens. We don't need yours. And frankly, I don't appreciate fear-mongering. We haven't had a serious tornado in this region in over 6 years." I opened my mouth, then closed it. It was not worth debating storm statistics with someone who thought anecdotes were evidence. Instead, I said I'd be happy to discuss this with the full board. "You can bring it up at the next HOA meeting," she said, already walking away. "But you'll still be fined if it's not removed by Tuesday." That night, I sat at my desk flipping through the HOA bylaws. I highlighted the relevant clauses. I noted the contradictions. I began drafting an appeal. But deep down, something unsettled me, not just the petty authoritarianism, but the underlying message. They didn't care what I knew. They cared what I looked like. A retired engineer trying to do a good thing was not part of their vision of this sanitized suburban utopia. The next morning, I noticed that my mailbox had a new sticker on it. Bright yellow. It read, "In violation, pending fine." It felt like the beginning of something I had not seen coming. Something I would have to weather alone. By the time I showed up at the HOA meeting the following Tuesday evening, my name was already a point of discussion, and not in a flattering way. I sat in a metal folding chair in the back of the community clubhouse, tucked in the corner near the exit. The room was lined with banners about seasonal gardening recycling initiatives and a surprisingly enthusiastic poster for an upcoming bake-off. You would think we were voting on pie crusts, not public safety. I wore a button-up tucked-in clean jeans and brought my folder of documentation licenses, technical breakdowns, photos, even a notarized letter from my former FEMA supervisor about the efficacy of residential sirens in low-density areas. But none of that mattered once Karen walked to the podium. She tapped her microphone twice, adjusted her blazer, and gave a tight smile to the 30 or so residents gathered. "Before we get to community events," she said sweetly, "we do need to address a matter of concern that has come up." A new homeowner on Linden Trail has installed a large industrial-grade siren in their backyard without board approval. People murmured. I kept still. Karen continued. "We've had multiple complaints from neighbors who are disturbed by the presence and potential noise of this installation. The board has deemed it to be out of compliance with the visual integrity standards and noise policies. This type of equipment, while perhaps appropriate in a municipal context, is not in harmony with the character of our neighborhood." She did not say my name, but she did not have to. Everyone turned toward me. I stood slowly, cleared my throat, and walked to the front. "My name is Noah Bailey. I'm the owner of the property on the corner of Linden Trail and Eastwood Avenue. And I'd like to respectfully correct the record." Karen's smile tightened like a noose. "I am a retired meteorological engineer. For over 3 decades, I've worked in atmospheric modeling, field analysis, and tornado recovery operations in 6 different states. The siren I installed is not industrial grade. It's a short-range civilian-grade weather alert system designed for private use. It is programmed to sound only during verified tornadic rotation within 2 miles of this neighborhood." I held up my paperwork. Furthermore, I've included copies of my permits, federal contractor credentials, and relevant HOA bylaw sections. Nowhere in the bylaws is there an explicit prohibition against non-commercial emergency equipment installed within private property lines. Karen's mic crackled as she leaned in. "Mr. Bailey, with all due respect, you're not in charge of neighborhood safety. That's what city emergency systems are for. We pay taxes for that." "City sirens have a known delay," I replied calmly. "During a fast-moving EF3, you could lose 30 to 60 seconds of warning. That's the difference between making it to your basement or not." A woman near the front raised her hand. "I live 2 doors down. I didn't even notice the test cycle. It wasn't that loud." Karen did not acknowledge her. "We will now vote to enforce the removal order. Any objections may be submitted in writing to the board." I took a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the edge of my folder. "Then let the record show I am submitting a formal objection backed by documentation. If necessary, I will seek an exemption through state civil emergency regulations." Karen looked at me like I had grown another head. "Excuse me. I worked with the Oklahoma State Emergency Management Office for 12 years, I said. And I still hold an inactive advisory credential. If the city deems my setup to be legal and beneficial, your board can't override that." The room went silent. Karen's nostrils flared. "Then I suggest you go talk to the city. In the meantime, the violation notice stands. We'll be fining you $75 per day starting Friday." People were whispering again. Someone actually muttered, "That's ridiculous." I did not recognize the voice, but it felt like a breath of fresh air amid the smog of control. I nodded once and stepped away. The next day, I walked out to find another HOA letter in my mailbox. This time, it was labeled "Final Warning." And taped underneath it crudely with masking tape was a handwritten note. "Don't drag the rest of us into your paranoia. Take it down, or we will." No signature, but I did not need one. The same morning, someone had egged the siren pole. I spent an hour wiping it down, steaming with quiet rage. Whoever did it knew where to hurt disrespect masked as community concern. But they also did not know me. I had spent years crawling through storm debris, being spat at by traumatized survivors and ignored by politicians. A little HOA drama would not break me. Later that night, I called an old friend at the county emergency office. He agreed to visit the site and look over my installation. His words were clear. "Noah, this setup is legal. HOA or not, you're within your rights if that siren doesn't exceed local decibel limits or interfere with utilities, and yours doesn't." That became my anchor. What came next, though, I was not ready for. A few days later, I was kneeling beside the Siren mast, tightening one of the secondary bolts near the base, when I heard footsteps crunch across the gravel behind me. I did not need to look up. The perfume-sharp synthetic gardenia and the impatient sigh gave it away. Still refusing to comply, I see. I stood wiping my hands on a rag. Karen Mulligan stood with one hand on her hip and the other holding a sleek black folder, thicker than last time. "Good afternoon," I said evenly. "If you're here to deliver another fine, you can save the paper. I already filed an appeal with the city and copied the State Emergency Management Office. I'm here," she said, flipping open the folder to inform you that the board has unanimously voted to escalate your violation. Effective Monday, your fines will be compounded and we are beginning proceedings for lien placement on your property. I stared at her. "You're putting a lien on my house for having a siren? For refusing to comply with community safety guidelines and for erecting unauthorized structures," she said crisply. "You had your chance. You were warned. You insisted on making this personal." "Karen," I said slowly, "this is personal. Tornadoes don't care about guidelines. They care about topography, pressure systems, and shear vectors. And we are overdue for a cell to cut right through this basin. You don't see it because you haven't spent your life watching Doppler loops at 3 a.m., while your phone rings from panicked townships trying to evacuate children in 15 minutes. Her eyes narrowed, unamused. "You don't get to threaten the neighborhood just because you spent your career chasing clouds." "Threaten," I repeated. "I've made no threats. I'm trying to protect people. That's what this is about." She took a step closer. "What it's about, Mr. Bailey, is control. You think you're above the rules. You think you can just show up in our quiet community with your equipment and your warnings and dictate how things should be done. Well, we have order here. We have standards, and if you can't respect them, perhaps this neighborhood isn't for you." The silence between us stretched. I could hear the wind picking up in the trees beyond the fence, unrelated but symbolically perfect. "I'm not going anywhere," I said finally, "and I'm not taking that siren down." She smiled tightly. "Then I suggest you contact a lawyer." She turned her heels clacking against the pavement like gunshots and walked off without another word. That night, I sat in my home office, surrounded by folders and reports, and stared at my screen. I had already sent documentation to the state. I had received confirmation that my installation did not violate any civil or safety codes. But HOA bylaws existed in a strange parallel world, often insulated from logic built on perception. I drafted another letter, this one more formal. I laid out my case. In bullet points, attached satellite maps showing our vulnerability, and even included a 10-year tornado path overlay showing how our little neighborhood sat right inside a historical funnel corridor. I backed it with FEMA documentation, county noise ordinances, and a signed statement from the state official who had reviewed the siren in person. I sent it certified to the board. I CC'd the city clerk. I even sent a copy to a local journalist I once worked with during a particularly brutal storm season. I did not expect an article, but I wanted a witness. The next morning, the retaliation came faster than I imagined. A city code officer showed up at my door, polite but apologetic, holding a form submitted anonymously, claiming I was conducting unauthorized utility operations and broadcasting hazardous signals. I showed him everything. He took photos, nodded in sympathy, and promised to close the report as a false claim. An hour later, my trash bin was overturned in the middle of the street. A neighbor I barely knew glanced out from behind her blinds and quickly disappeared. And that evening, as I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee watching the clouds shift in the distance, Karen walked up again this time, with a man in tow. He was dressed in a blue polo with a clipboard tucked under his arm, clearly a technician of some kind. "We're here," Karen announced triumphantly, "to inspect and disable your unauthorized siren system." I stood. "You don't have the right to." "We have board authorization," she said, holding up a single sheet of printed paper with shaky wording and an embossed stamp that meant nothing legally. "This falls under emergency nuisance abatement." The technician looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I was contracted to check the unit's power feed and disconnect it temporarily. I was told there was a neighborhood complaint about false alarms." "There haven't been any false alarms," I said, locking eyes with Karen. Karen just smiled. "We're being proactive. Isn't that what you're always preaching?" I blocked the technician's path. "You're not touching it without a warrant. And if you do, You'll be liable for any damages. This equipment is federally certified and protected under private use guidelines. You're trespassing." Karen stepped forward, her voice low. "Try to stop me and we'll see how fast your little exemptions hold up in court." The technician hesitated, then looked at me. "I'm not doing this," he said quietly, stepping back. "I didn't sign up for a legal mess." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Karen fuming in the middle of my driveway. "This isn't over," she hissed. "No," I said, "it's just beginning." I went inside and pulled up radar. A dry line was forming over the western counties. A pressure drop. Too early to call it. But I felt it. The way your body knows the hum beneath your skin when something's coming. The storm was not here yet, but it would be. And they would wish that Siren was still working. It started with a yellow envelope, then another, then two more in the same week, each stamped with bold red letters. Final notice. Escalated violation. Daily fine accrual notice. The HOA was not just posturing anymore. They were digging in, weaponizing paper and policy against me, with the kind of petty vindictiveness I had seen in bureaucracies clinging to fragile power. Each letter claimed I owed a fine, $75 per day, then $100, then escalating toward $150 for maintaining unauthorized, hazardous equipment and refusing to comply with lawful HOA directives. They had even included glossy printouts of the Siren as Exhibit A, taken from the sidewalk like it was some dangerous monument. I called their bluff. I knew my rights. But each day more envelopes, more threats. By the end of the month, they claimed I owed $3,250. I was not intimidated. I was furious. What made it worse was the silence of the neighborhood. Not outright hostility, at least not yet, but a cold, passive stillness. Lawnmowers would stop when I walked by. Conversations would hush on front porches. The only exception was Mrs. Delaney, an elderly widow who lived across the street. She brought me lemon bars one afternoon and whispered, "I think what you're doing is brave." Then she shuffled away, looking over her shoulder like someone might see her. Karen, on the other hand, was thriving. I saw her one morning in a wide-brimmed sun hat pruning roses at the community roundabout, chatting with two other board members like nothing had happened, like she had not turned a basic weather precaution into a personal crusade. That same week, I received another surprise. A formal letter from the HOA attorney. Notice of intent to file lien. They were serious, or at least they wanted me to believe they were. So I lawyered up. I contacted Rebecca Mason, a firecracker of an attorney who specialized in HOA abuse and constitutional property law. She had a reputation for dismantling overreaching neighborhood associations and was not shy about taking cases to court. After reading through my stack of documentation, her first words were, "They're bluffing hard, but if they keep pushing, we push back harder." She helped me draft a cease and desist letter, addressed to the board demanding an immediate halt to all fines and threats of lien under penalty of tortious interference and harassment. We attached all the legal precedents cases where HOAs lost when attempting to interfere with private safety installations, especially in severe weather zones. We also filed an ought injunction notice, with the county clerk making it clear that any attempt to tamper with my equipment or property would trigger immediate litigation. But I did not stop there. I reached out to the Oklahoma Weather Response Network and requested an independent site visit. A colleague, Darius Wells, a regional disaster response coordinator and fellow weather geek, drove down the following week with a portable Doppler rig and a signed authorization badge. We ran a full inspection of my system, took decibel readings, and confirmed compliance with all noise ordinances. Darius even sent a follow-up email praising the setup, calling it an ideal model for residential-level preparedness in rural/suburban gaps in alert systems. I printed the email. I added it to my ever-growing binder. Then came the next escalation, the vote. Karen scheduled a special session of the HOA, claiming it was to address ongoing threats to neighborhood cohesion and tranquility. I knew what it meant. She was trying to rally the neighborhood against me to turn this into a referendum, not just on the Siren, but on me. I attended the meeting in the same folding chair clubhouse as before. But this time the energy was darker. Karen stood at the front, dressed like she was hosting a charity gala, smiling thinly as residents filed in. The Siren had become the scapegoat. "He's scaring our children," one parent claimed. "It's just too aggressive," said another. It feels like we're living in a war zone. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, placed my hands on the podium, and said, I understand your concerns, but I won't apologize for trying to protect this community. Tornadoes don't check with your board before they touch down. You won't get a polite letter from Mother Nature. All you'll have is seconds, and this siren could buy them for you. Karen folded her arms. I went on. You're not voting on aesthetics tonight. You're voting on whether a resident with knowledge credentials and a heart for public safety should be silenced because you're uncomfortable. There was a silence that lingered longer than I expected, but in the end, the board voted 6-1 in favor of Karen's motion. The fines would continue. The legal pressure would escalate. They even authorized a contractor to come remove the structure if I did not comply within 10 days. But I did not flinch. Instead, I added more reinforcement to the siren's pole. I backed up the software to a remote server. And I waited. Because while they were watching me calculating fines and calling me paranoid, I was watching the sky. And it was beginning to shift. A pressure trough. Subtle, but steady. The models were conflicted, but my gut, honed by decades of listening to the wind, told me something was coming. And when it did, no HOA fine in the world would stop it. The contractor arrived on a Tuesday morning unannounced, but not unexpected. His truck was white unmarked and parked just outside my driveway, like he was not sure if he was trespassing or delivering flowers. I was already in the backyard, notebook in hand, analyzing shifting air mass readings when I saw him step out, clipboard under his arm, confusion written all over his face. He did not wear a uniform, just jeans, a ball cap, and a faded red shirt that said Bill's General Services. He walked slowly toward the siren mast, squinting up at it like he did not quite know what he was looking at. Can I help you? I asked, walking toward the fence gate. He startled. Yeah. I'm here about the pole. You mean the federally compliant, state-inspected, privately installed weather alert system, I said, arms crossed. He blinked. Yeah, that. I motioned toward the edge of the property line. Do you have a removal order? He fumbled with his clipboard, flipping through sheets. The HOA hired me to take it down. Said it was a safety concern. I took a step forward. Do you have a court order? Because if you don't, what you're about to do is illegal. He froze. Tampering with registered emergency equipment, especially one inspected and documented by the State Emergency Office, is a criminal offense in Oklahoma. You cut one bolt, and I promise I'll have county deputies here before your truck leaves the block. He backed up slowly. They didn't say anything about legal stuff. They just said it was a nuisance. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of his face, his license plate, his clipboard. He did not protest. Consider this notice that you are trespassing, I said calmly. You're being recorded. If you take another step toward that pole, you'll be part of a lawsuit by sunset. He turned around, got back in his truck, and drove off without another word. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Karen. Her voice was stiff. We had a contractor walk off the job this morning. He claimed you threatened him. I informed him of the law, I replied. There's a difference. You're escalating this, Mr. Bailey, she hissed. We've been more than patient. Karen, you're one step away from violating federal emergency codes. Do you really want this to go to court? There was a pause. Then she said coldly, we'll see how long you can keep this up. And she hung up. That night, the skies turned a deep electric gray. I stood in the backyard sipping coffee, watching the tree lines in the distance shudder under a southern gust. A hot wind, wrong for the season. I flipped open my laptop and ran a quick model overlay with the Storm Prediction Center feed. The State Weather Service had issued a watch, but not a warning. The national radar had not picked it up yet, but I could see it. I could feel it. A dry line bulge was tightening just west of the Arkansas River, dragging unstable air behind it like a fisherman pulling slack. I sent a message to Darius. Tell your people to watch Tulsa County. Models aren't catching it yet, but something's building. I'm seeing a 978 millbar drop south of Woodward. His reply came quickly. Copy that. Let me call dispatch. By midnight, the temperature had not dropped. The sky was thick and sluggish, like it was holding its breath. I ran a final system test on the Siren silent mode lights only, and everything came back green. Then I opened my front door and found a piece of paper on the doormat. No envelope, just a folded sheet torn from a notepad in angry handwriting. If that thing screams one more time, we'll take it down ourselves. No name, no signature, but I knew. They were not just annoyed anymore. They were angry, maybe even scared. Karen had spun a narrative so deep that now they believed the siren was the threat, not what it warned against. The next day, a public HOA email went out with the subject line: Severe Weather and Community Guidelines. It read, "Residents are advised to remain calm during this week's forecast. Please do not respond to unauthorized alarms or take shelter based on non-city signals. Official alerts will be sent via county systems only. Any rogue alerts should be ignored." Rogue alerts. They had called my siren rogue. That was when I realized just how far they were willing to go to preserve the illusion of control, even if it meant telling people to ignore a tornado. I made one last effort. I printed a simple flyer with a radar map, a warning in bold letters. Unstable conditions building west of county. If sirens sound, take shelter immediately. City systems may delay. This is your backup. Use it. I walked door to door and left them in mailboxes, even under windshield wipers. Some people threw them away. Others glanced at me like I was mad. Only Mrs. Delaney thanked me. But I was not doing it for thanks. I was doing it because I could feel the pressure falling. Because I knew the wind was not right. Because every bone in my retired body told me something was coming. And no HOA fine, no Karen edict, no legal trap was going to stop it. When the air is wrong, you listen. I had. They had not. Soon they would understand. It was the kind of heat that did not just sit on your skin. It pressed down through your clothes into your chest, clinging to your lungs like wet cotton. That Thursday afternoon, the air felt wrong. The birds were quiet. The trees did not sway, they braced. Every leaf curled under as if anticipating pain. The wind was missing, but not still, not peaceful. It was more like the breath being held before a scream. By 4 o'clock, my internal barometer had dropped 4 millibars in under 90 minutes. My radar panel lit up with radial velocity signatures. Nothing conclusive, not yet, but they were forming in patterns I had learned to trust more than any forecast. My gut twisted in the same way it had years ago when I stood on the outskirts of Greensburg, Kansas, the night it disappeared. Still, the news was quiet. The state had not escalated past a tornado watch, and the local channels were deep in sports coverage. No one wanted to sound the alarm first, except me. I stepped outside to check the sky, directly squinting upward at the anvil-shaped cloud blooming slowly over the western ridgeline. The top was crisp, sharp as a blade, rising fast, unnaturally fast. A textbook supercell. I did not need to wait for the meteorologists downtown to catch up. I grabbed my radio and flicked on my short-range transmitter, tuned to a private frequency monitored by county emergency groups and old field volunteers like myself. This is Bailey Corner of Linden Trail and Eastwood. I'm seeing a rotation north-northwest approximate hook forming over Sand Springs. Towering cumulonimbus at 52,000 feet. Barometric freefall continues. Velocity signatures approaching threshold. A pause, then Darius came on. "Confirmed," he said. "We've got spotters pinging similar data. But the county's still dragging their heels. They're waiting for NWS to issue the full warning." "It'll be too late," I muttered. "We've got maybe 20 minutes. "Understood. Stay safe, brother." I set the phone down and opened the garage, jogging around back to the siren mast. My hand hovered over the manual trigger. I did not want to do it. But I would rather lose sleep and another round of HOA lawsuits than lose someone's child to a collapsed roof. I pressed the trigger. The siren wound up with that slow-rising scream I had tested 100 times but never used for real. The sound cut through the air like a knife rising and falling in haunting waves. The birds scattered, dogs began barking, doors opened, and across the street, Karen stepped out onto her porch. I saw her expression from 50 feet away, one of outrage and disbelief, like I had personally insulted her by alerting the neighborhood to impending death. She shouted something I could not hear over the siren and disappeared back inside. A few neighbors stepped out, nervous, uncertain. One man across the street waved at me and mouthed, "Is it real?" I nodded once. At that moment, a city siren in the far distance finally echoed the warning, though it was faint, almost imperceptible. Another followed 30 seconds later from a firehouse a few miles away. But mine had sounded first, and then the sky turned green. Not metaphorically, literally. If you have ever been in a real tornado threat zone, you know that hue. It is not a trick of the light, it is a signature of hail cores and violent updrafts of atmospheric ingredients stirring into catastrophe. It is the color of danger made visible. The power flickered. Thunder cracked so loud it shook windows. I watched Karen burst back out of her house with a phone pressed to her ear, frantically dialing. She pointed toward me, toward the siren, her mouth moving in angry spasms. And then the warning came in officially. Phones buzzed. TVs interrupted. Tornado warning. Take shelter immediately. I turned back to my system and checked the last sweep. Rotation had tightened just west of us, traveling fast. We had 10 minutes, maybe less. I ran inside and hit the final override. The siren would now pulse every 60 seconds until canceled manually. Outside chaos began. Cars reversed out of driveways. People ran down sidewalks, dragging children, clutching dogs. One man dropped a box of groceries trying to get to his storm cellar. The clouds dropped lower, trees bent. Then, without warning, hail the size of golf balls began to fall, slamming roofs and splintering branches. One cracked the hood of a car 2 houses down. And still Karen was yelling. She was on her front lawn, screaming into her phone, pointing at the siren like it was the enemy. She did not notice the wind shifting direction, or the way the trees leaned unnaturally, or how the air suddenly smelled like wet asphalt and ozone. She did not notice the funnel forming in the sky behind her. But I did. I shouted across the street, "Karen, get inside now." She turned mid-sentence, saw my face, not anger now, but fear, and turned to look behind her. The tornado touched down half a mile out. It was not wide, but it was fast. A pale gray whip twisting from the clouds, dancing down like a ghost with claws. And it was headed straight for us. She froze. I sprinted across the yard toward her, dodging hailstones, and grabbed her arm without asking. She resisted for half a second, still caught up in her fury, until the roar began. It was not a sound. It was a vibration, like the earth itself had opened and was inhaling everything above. Karen's face turned white. We ran. I dragged her toward my house, into my garage, past the generator, and into the storm shelter, embedded in the floor, poured concrete, reinforced after my second year in Kansas. I slammed the hatch shut just as debris began to hit the house. The lights went out. The wind above turned savage, clawing at everything. Inside, Karen sat on the floor, shaking her mouth open, but silent now. We both listened as the world outside bent, broke, and howled. I had tried to warn them. They had not listened. And now the sky was screaming for them instead. The storm shelter was not soundproof. It was deep and solid, yes, poured concrete sealed tight with a steel hatch, but sound still found its way in. The wind above raged like an engine, spinning out of control. There were crashes, gut-punching thuds, followed by scraping metal, the whine of shingles being torn from roofs, and the unmistakable snap of trees cracking in half. Then came the sirens, not mine, but the distant ones, late scattered across the county like a belated apology. Karen sat across from me, knees tucked to her chest, hair wild, breathing shallow. Her HOA blazer was soaked through. She still clutched her phone in one hand, though the signal had long since dropped. Neither of us spoke. What could we say? Time passed strangely in the dark. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 12. Then quiet. A deep, bone-deep silence. Not peace. Absence. Like the world outside had been erased. I slowly cracked open the hatch. The air that rushed in was warm and smelled like damp earth and insulation. I climbed up first cautiously, then turned and helped Karen out, her hands trembling as they reached for mine. The sky was still dark, but lighter toward the edges, thinning out in the east. The storm had moved on, but it had left scars. My garage roof was half gone. Siding had been stripped from the north wall like peeling bark. My radar dish lay crumpled on the lawn. But the siren mast still stood. Across the street was a different story. Karen's house, gone. The entire back half had been sheared off, exposing insulation, twisted metal, and the splintered remains of a baby grand piano, now sitting in the middle of what used to be her living room. Windows blown out, fence demolished, her rose garden flattened into muddy pulp. She just stood there frozen, as if waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake. A few doors down, a pickup truck had been hurled through a neighbor's fence. Another home had lost its second floor completely. I could see shattered glass, collapsed porch columns, and dazed families climbing out of crawl spaces and bathtubs. But it could have been worse. So much worse. Most people had taken shelter, because of the siren. Not the city one. Not the official county system. Mine. The one they had tried to silence. And everyone knew it. Within the hour, emergency crews began arriving, flashing lights, weaving through debris, calling out names, checking homes. I directed them where I could. I pointed out which houses had kids, which ones had pets, which elderly neighbors needed checking. No one questioned me. No one asked if I was with the city. I was simply the man who had known, the man who had warned them. Karen followed me wordless, like a shadow. Her hand shook when she tried to dial her husband. The call would not go through. She looked up at me then for the first time, like she was actually seeing me not as a nuisance or threat, but as someone who had pulled her out of the storm. She began, voice rasping. No. I did not answer. I did not need to. She lowered her gaze. I watched her shoulders collapse inward, as if years of control of power and order had all been stripped from her like the walls of her home. As we stood there, a young EMT jogged toward us from across the street. She was covered in dust and sweat, eyes wide. "We just checked the south corner," she said breathlessly. "Those homes didn't get the city alert in time. Half the systems failed. Too much traffic, too little signal. But..." She paused, glancing toward my yard, that siren. "That thing probably saved lives tonight." Karen looked down at her feet. I did not say a word. By dusk, the news vans had arrived. Helicopters hovered. Reporters and windbreakers stood in the wreckage, with microphones delivering their solemn voiceovers about the unexpected path and surprise touchdown. They spoke of how lucky it was that so many residents had taken shelter early. They used words like miracle and close call. One of them approached me, camera crew in tow. "Sir, we've been told you were responsible for the early warning. Can you comment?" I hesitated, glancing around at the destruction. A few neighbors stood nearby, watching. One of them, a man who had once sneered at me during an HOA meeting, gave a small nod. "I'm just glad people are safe," I said. "That's all that matters." "But your siren did what it was built to do," I interrupted. "I did not want glory. I did not want revenge. I wanted them to remember." As the sun finally broke through the thinning clouds, I watched Karen be escorted by 2 firemen into what was left of her house. She stepped over a shattered planter, paused at the doorframe, then turned to look back at me, at the siren, at the neighborhood still standing. And she finally understood. Not through lawsuits, not through debate, through consequence. The sky had done what I could not. And the siren they hated, it had become the sound they would one day thank me for. By the time the last flashes of lightning faded behind the retreating storm wall, the neighborhood looked like a battlefield. Broken fences, crumpled mailboxes, roofs that now resembled crushed cereal boxes. But in the midst of it all, people were alive. That was the miracle. And that was the measure. I moved with purpose. The training never leaves you, not after years in the field, not after nights pulling survivors out of tractor trailers pinned under trees. Your hands remember what your mind forgets. Check pulse, check airway. Assess structure, listen for movement. Mrs. Delaney was the first I helped. Her front door had jammed shut from warping, and she had been trapped in her hallway for over an hour. I pried it open with a crowbar and found her clutching, her cat eyes wide but smiling. "I knew it," she whispered. "I heard your siren before anything else." I carried her out and flagged down a paramedic. Further down Linden Trail, the Lopez family was trying to free their teenage son from a collapsed stairwell. I crawled in, bracing fallen sheetrock with a broken shovel handle, while we pulled him out. No broken bones, just bruises and shock. His mother hugged me so tightly, I nearly lost my footing. "You saved him," she sobbed. "If we'd waited for the city sirens..." I did not reply. I just kept moving. And then I saw the fire truck parked outside Karen's house, or what was left of it. Her husband, Greg, had been in the kitchen when the twister hit. A support beam collapsed onto his leg, trapping him under rubble. The fire crew was trying to saw through debris when I arrived, but the tools kept catching on twisted metal. "Wait," I said, stepping up beside the firefighter. "There's a crawl space under that section. If we dig in from behind, through the flower beds, we can get to him without cutting." They hesitated. "Trust me," I added. "That part of the house was built on a raised foundation. I saw the blueprints before I bought mine." They nodded. 3 of us scrambled to the side yard and started digging by hand. Karen was there too, on her knees, mud on her blouse hair, wild. Her hands were bleeding from clawing at the earth. "I should have listened," she whispered as we worked. "I told Greg it was nothing. I said your siren was a nuisance. I said nothing." We dug until our fingers went numb. until the dirt gave way to wood and shadow and the faint, muffled sound of a man groaning. When we finally broke through, I was the first to squeeze into the space and reach him. His leg was pinned, but the bone was not shattered. I stabilized it with a split 2x4, wrapped it in a towel, and signaled for a stretcher. We pulled him out an hour later, alive. Karen fell beside him sobbing. The local news crew caught it all. By midnight, the fire captain approached me, his helmet tucked under his arm, boots covered in plaster dust. "You're Noah, right? The guy with the siren?" I nodded. He looked around the wreckage, then back at me. "Your system gave people a head start. We estimate at least 60 seconds. That doesn't sound like much to most folks, but in this work, that's everything." I felt the lump rise in my throat before I could swallow it down. "I did what anyone would do," I said. "No," he corrected, "you did what few have the guts to do. You stood alone, and you were right." He handed me a folded sheet of paper. "You'll want to keep this. Official commendation from the Emergency Management Director. They're submitting your name for civil recognition." I did not unfold it. Not yet. It did not feel like a time for honors. Not when half the street was still without power and one of my radar dishes lay in 3 pieces on the lawn. That night, I sat on the porch of what remained of my home beneath a tarp someone had graciously nailed over the missing portion of my roof. The siren mast stood tall in the moonlight, dented but intact, its red light blinking calmly now as if it had simply done its job. Across the street, Karen came out with a flashlight. Her eyes met mine. No scowl, no posture. Just a woman stripped bare of position and pretense. She walked over slowly, each step heavy. "I wanted to say thank you," she murmured. I nodded. "I was wrong," she added. "About all of it. I let my pride—" Her voice cracked. "I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. But I wasn't protecting anyone." I stayed silent. "I understand if you don't forgive me," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not looking for revenge, Karen," I finally said. "I was only ever looking for respect for the science, for the risk, for the people who live here." She nodded slowly. "I'm resigning from the board, effective immediately." That surprised me, but I did not argue. "I've already spoken to the other members," she continued. "They're calling a special meeting next week to rewrite the emergency bylaws. Your system will be officially recognized. You'll be given full exemption and a platform to recommend future protections." I exhaled. It was more than I expected, more than I thought would ever come from her. Karen looked back toward her battered home. "Greg's going to be okay. Because of you. I won't forget that." Neither would the rest of the neighborhood. Because now they had heard the siren, and this time, they had listened. Over the following week, the neighborhood turned into a temporary construction zone. Ladders propped against fractured walls, tarps flapping in the wind, the scent of wet lumber and gasoline thick in the air. FEMA arrived within 48 hours with mobile response trailers. The Red Cross set up tents near the community clubhouse. I spent most of my days coordinating between families and recovery crews, acting as an unofficial liaison. No one asked me to, but no one stopped me either. The storm had left its mark, but it had also reset the board. Karen's resignation triggered a ripple effect. 2 other HOA board members stepped down soon after, citing stress and conflict of interest. Whether out of guilt or to save face, I did not know. But it opened the door. A community meeting was scheduled in the gymnasium of the local elementary school, one of the only large buildings that had not suffered structural damage. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and for the first time since I had moved here, people filled every one of them. I was seated near the back, not planning to speak. But when Karen stepped to the mic and announced the board vacancies and the upcoming election to rebuild leadership with transparency and safety in mind, someone from the crowd shouted, "Let Noah speak." Another voice echoed it. "Yeah, he's the reason we're standing here." Karen looked toward me, not with hostility this time, but something closer to reverence, and gave a nod. I stood slowly, walked toward the mic, and looked out at the sea of tired, sunburned, bruised but breathing neighbors. I never meant to start a war. I began. I moved here for peace. I installed that siren not because I wanted to make noise, but because I knew what silence could cost. I paused, letting that land. I worked in disaster response for over 30 years. I've seen towns erased, families separated by 5-second delays. I didn't want that for any of you. For us. Heads nodded. When the storm hit, I wasn't thinking about fines or violations. I was thinking about the kids next door, the elderly woman across the street, the family on the corner with the boy who likes to skateboard in the driveway. I was thinking about you. The room went silent, heavy with shared memory. I don't want a position on the board, I continued, but I will accept the offer to form a safety subcommittee. One that actually listens to data. One that prepares, not reacts. A murmur of agreement swept through the room. And one more thing, I added, looking directly at Karen. I don't hate you. She blinked. I hated what you stood for. The need to control at the cost of truth. But standing next to you in that shelter, hearing the wind rip this neighborhood apart, I saw something else. I saw a person afraid, just like the rest of us. She swallowed and gave the smallest of nods. After the meeting, people came up to me in clusters, offering handshakes, hugs, baked goods, apologies. One woman gave me a hand-drawn thank you card from her 6-year-old son. A man I had never spoken to before offered to repair my damaged fence free of charge. Community had finally arrived, but it took the storm to reveal it. A few days later, I received an envelope in the mail from the state's Office of Emergency Preparedness. Inside was a commendation letter signed and sealed, recognizing outstanding civilian initiative in emergency warning systems. Along with it was a small medal and a lapel pin shaped like a lightning bolt. It was humbling, but what moved me more was the next envelope. No return address, just a folded sheet of paper with shaky handwriting. Mr. Bailey, I was wrong. I told people you were a troublemaker, that you were just trying to stir up fear. But when your siren went off, I ran. My wife, my daughter, my dog, we all ran to the basement. And we're alive. Thank you to Tom Wilkins, Lot 42. The man who once yelled at me from his lawn. I kept that note pinned to my refrigerator. The legal proceedings against the HOA board began within the month. Several residents filed a class action suit, alleging negligence, psychological distress, and suppression of safety protocols. Karen was named reluctantly, but cooperated with the investigation. She even gave a deposition acknowledging that her actions were rooted in personal bias and aesthetic preference over verified risk. It was the kind of self-awareness I never expected. The lawsuit did not aim to bankrupt the HOA, but to force it into reform, and it worked. The board was dissolved. A temporary advisory committee was installed with rotating members and open forums for all community decisions. One of the new bylaw amendments. No safety equipment, personal or otherwise, could be restricted without cause verified by a certified safety authority. The Siren stayed. Not only that, it was upgraded. Funded by community donations, wired into a backup generator, and linked with the city's emergency alert systems. The new sign beneath it read, Community Early Warning System in honor of preparedness. I did not ask them to do that, but when I saw it, I smiled. It was never about the storm itself. It was about what the storm revealed beneath the politics, the pettiness, the manicured hedges, and HOA meeting minutes. It showed who we were when things cracked, who ran, who helped, who listened, and who finally learned how. Months passed. The broken branches were cleared. Roofs were patched, some fully rebuilt. You could drive down Linden Trail now and barely notice the wounds unless you looked closely, unless you knew where to look. The siren still stood behind my garage, but it was different now. It no longer felt like a defiant act of protection. It felt like part of the landscape. The same neighbors who once complained now nodded at it as they walked their dogs. Children rode their bikes past it unfazed, sometimes pausing to ask how it worked. I always answered, and always added, it's not about fear. It's about readiness. I had become something I never set out to be, a fixture. The quiet one at the corner house with a past in storm tracking and a coffee pot always brewing. Every few weeks, a new face would knock on my door to ask about weather radios, backup generators, safe room retrofits. I never charged for my time. I figured knowledge was the only thing worth spreading after everything else had tried to bury it. Karen came by too once a week at first. She would ask how I was, sometimes bringing over cookies she had burned a little, or jars of jam with crooked labels. One afternoon, she brought me a small potted rose bush. It's from the ones that survived, she said, referring to her old garden. They're tougher than they look. I planted it near the base of the Siren. It bloomed that spring. Karen never ran for HOA leadership again, though she stayed involved quietly. She had started organizing neighborhood emergency drills with me, something that would have been unimaginable just a season ago. Once, while reviewing evacuation maps, she said softly, "You were never the threat. My fear was." She looked away. "The storm didn't just take my house, Noah. It took my certainty. and I think that's what saved me. There was healing in that. Not perfection, not forgetfulness, but growth. The new HOA functioned less like an authority and more like a cooperative. Residents began volunteering skills. An off-duty firefighter started teaching CPR workshops. A nurse offered first aid classes. The younger families banded together to create a neighborhood supply kit stocked in the old clubhouse. I was asked to host a monthly session called Weather for Real Life. The first one had 5 people. The next had 20. By June, we had to move it to the library. Sometimes late at night, I would walk out into my yard and stare up at the sky the way I used to before radar, before models. Just eyes and instinct. Sometimes the wind would rustle in a way that made me tense, but it passed. The trauma was still there. You do not go through a tornado, physical or social, without scars. But I had found stillness in the place that had once rejected me. Then one morning in early summer, I got a letter in the mail. Thick envelope, no return address. Inside was a brief note and an invitation. Mr. Bailey, your name was submitted for a National Weather Service Community Impact Award. We'd be honored to recognize your actions during the April 7th storm event. Ceremony to be held in Norman next month. Please RSVP, Regional Director, NWS. I sat for a long time at the table holding the letter, thinking about the first meeting where they called me paranoid, about the fines, about the egg on my siren pole, about dragging Karen into the shelter as the sky tried to tear us apart. Then I looked out the window at the siren at the rosebush, blooming bright red at its base, at a child riding his scooter in the distance, waving to me with one hand. I smiled. Then I stood, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. As I passed the siren, I reached out and touched the steel. It was warm from the sun, no longer a symbol of rebellion, now a reminder of what it means to stand firm, of what it means to warn, even when no one wants to hear it, of what it means to love a place enough to fight for it. And in that peace after the storm, I finally found my home.